Hello, and welcome to today's lesson on brain anatomy. Now, the goal is to use some models to show you some of the anatomical terms you will be held responsible for. Your lab supplement does have a list of brain anatomy terms that you should be familiar with for the post-lab quiz coming up next week. The brains that you're seeing here, the one on the left is a rather high-priced anatomical model purchased through a biological supply company. The one on the right is quite a nifty little model purchased for roughly $40 to $50 off of Amazon. So we're going to take a peek at both of these and see what they have to show us about the brain. And we're going to start with the colored model here. Now, the brain is divided into two hemispheres. So right now we're looking at the rostral end, and the back of the brain is known as the caudal end. And these terms are used because the brain does not sit truly in a purely superficial to inferior, a superior to inferior or anterior to posterior. This is a more complex structure. So typically we use the terms rostral to caudal, and we utilize those terms because these different areas of the brain form at different times developmentally, making different regions of the brain. And so rostral means towards the nose and caudal means towards the tail. Now, developmentally, we do have both the left and the right hemisphere. So this is the left hemisphere. Remember, we're always thinking in anatomical position, and this is the right hemisphere. You'll notice down the center here is something known as the longitudinal sulcus, or the longitudinal fissure. And this is what's going to divide the brain into right and left halves. Now, deep, there is something that connects the brain. The right side of your brain is connected to the left side of your brain. Good work there. Okay, so this is anatomical right, this is anatomical left. Another thing that you're going to notice is that there are lobes of the brain. So if we look at this laterally, you're going to find your frontal lobe, and the very front is known as the prefrontal cortex. It's something that is better developed in humans relative to other animals. The frontal lobe, it contains a lot of motor control. So in previous units, we've talked about the primary motor area, or the motor cortex, and that's this red cortex here. This right here, the gray and the blue, is the parietal lobe, and this dark blue is the primary sensory cortex with other association areas illustrated in gray. So here's our parietal lobe, this was our frontal lobe. The very back, we have the occipital lobe, so I'll rotate it so you can see the bilaterally symmetrical occipital lobe, and you'll notice there's a colored area here. This is the primary optic area. This is where all sensation from the rods and cones of the eye is sent to, and then the rest of the occipital lobe is an association area that allows us to compare what we see in the way of incoming visual images to what we know about the world around us. And then there's also the temporal lobe here, which you see sitting roughly where your ear is, lateral on the brain. And again, it is bilaterally symmetrical. So here is your temporal lobe on the left side of the brain. Okay, a couple of other sulcuses or fissures that become important to us. So the ridges are called gyri, and the grooves are called a sulcus or a fissure. And so this one right here is the central sulcus. You'll notice if we look from above that the central sulcus is the only sulcus that crosses the midline. And that is what divides our frontal lobe from our parietal lobe. There's also a lateral fissure. And so if you look over here, you're going to see right kind of from where the central sulcus is, there's a fissure that runs right here. This is the lateral fissure, and that's going to divide the temporal lobe from the parietal and a bit of the frontal lobe as well. Okay, so frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. There's a deeper inner lobe known as the insula that is not visible from the superior. We also have some grooves. So we have our central sulcus here, crosses the midline. Our longitudinal fissure runs the longitudinal section of the brain. And here is a lateral fissure to divide from the temporal lobe to the parietal lobe. Okay, now other areas that are going to be important on the frontal lobe and really the language side of our brain, you can find on the left side of the brain. And so what we're going to find is this little region here with the green, and this little region here with the blue. These are our language association areas. So on the frontal lobe, this actually should sit a little bit further forward. It does sit on the frontal lobe, and it's known as the Broca's area. This one on the back near the parietal lobe, but also sitting somewhat on the junction with the temporal lobe, is known as the Wernicke's. This is a German word, so although it starts with a W, it's pronounced with a V sound. Okay. The precentral gyrus is another term for the primary motor. So precentral, in front of the central sulcus, precentral gyrus, which means we have a postcentral gyrus here on the parietal lobe. Okay, other important things to note on the parietal lobe, aside from the Wernicke's area, is that this gray area is known as association areas, and this is going to take in the sensations that we feel, texture, deep pressure, light pressure, all of those things that we learned in the way of sensory receptors. It's going to be integrated in this area of the brain. And if we look at the temporal lobe, you will also find that this is where our olfactory centers sit, our gustatory centers, and even our primary auditory cortex, so that area of the brain where sound is coming in. Now, if we take this brain, I'm going to carefully lift off so that we can look at the brain in hemi-transection, so half of the brain. You're going to find elements of the frontal lobe, elements of the parietal lobe, and elements of the occipital lobe that you can see. This structure right here is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, this region is known as the genu of the corpus callosum. That's the anterior or rostral end of the corpus callosum. And the posterior or caudal end of the corpus callosum is known as the splenium. Sitting just below that is a yo-yo based structure right here, and that is the thalamus. The thalamus helps make up part of the third ventricle, so you're seeing some of the third ventricle, and this gray matter with the illustrated blood vessels is supposed to represent the choroid plexus, combination of blood vessels and epidermal cells. This right here, right underneath the corpus callosum, is the interventricular septum, and this is going to be, or septum pellucidum. Septum pellucidum is another name, and this is going to divide the lateral ventricles, which are not visible on this model. Just below the thalamus, it's an area known as the hypothalamus, and off of that hangs down the pituitary gland. So off of the very bottom here, the little white nub would be connected to the pituitary gland. Both the thalamus and the hypothalamus are components of the diencephalon. And there's also an epithalamus. It's a little pinecone shaped structure that sits right back here, and that is known as the pineal gland. As we look from rostral to caudal, and we start to consider the anatomy of the brainstem, this first region is the midbrain. It is characterized by a bump right here, which is the mammary body, as well as inferior and superior colliculi. Superior would be the top, inferior is the bottom. There are 4 colliculi, and they cumulatively make up the quadrigemina area. From the midbrain, just below is a bulge, and that bulge is known as the pons, and below that is the medulla oblongata. The third ventricle will drain down a duct into the fourth ventricle that you can see right here, and then out the fourth ventricle down the spinal cord, or through apertures into the space around the brain. The other thing that you can notice here is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is gray matter at its surface. That gray matter ridges at the surface is known as folia, and the white matter on the inside is known as the arbor vitae. There's a significant number of neurons in this structure, which serves purposes including posture and balance, as well as comparing incoming signals with outgoing intentions. We're going to take a quick look over here at this half of the brain, because this half does have some lettering on it. And what you're able to see here, that A is showing the insula, so that fifth lobe. You also have frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. The genu and the splenium of the corpus callosum. Here is the septum pellucidum that is dividing the two lateral ventricles. The interventricular foramina collects fluid from both of the ventricles and drops it down into the third ventricle, which the thalamus partially makes up. It makes up part of the wall, and so you can see the gray again, which is the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus has blood vessels and ependymal cells. That fluid is then shunted down through this right here, the cerebral aqueduct, or the aqueduct of Sylvius, which is the empydim, into the fourth ventricle, and then from the fourth ventricle it would drain down the central of the spinal cord, down through the medulla oblongata, or out apertures into the subarachnoid space. D represents the midbrain, E is your pons, and F is the region of the medulla oblongata. Right here, you're looking at B to reference the cerebellum, the great comparator, showing both the arbor vitae and the folia. And then 3 here is that optic area, the visual area that is going to be receiving signals from the optic nerve. So nice colored image. If only our bodies, if only real brains looked like this. Even real brains don't look like this. So this is the Amazon model. I like this model because it comes apart a little bit better. And I do like that they've illustrated the vascularization of the brain, because the brain is very, very vascular. We can find the longitudinal fissure. We know, looking laterally, that we have a frontal lobe and a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. And here's an element of that lateral fissure. If I look along that lateral fissure, I should be able to find a fissure that's going to come all the way up and crosses the midline and comes all the way down the other side. Okay, so this is the central sulcus, longitudinal sulcus, and transverse. So what that tells me is that this is the post-central gyrus. Sorry, this is the pre-central gyrus, or the primary motor area, and this is the post-central gyrus, or the primary sensory area. A lot of association motor control here. Our prefrontal cortex is where we determine a lot of our thought, our personality, various things there. Occipital lobe back at the very back is going to have an association area just like the association area of the parietal lobe. And the temporal lobe will also have the gustatory, the olfactory, and the auditory association areas in that region. Now obviously this looks quite a bit different, and right here at the junction of the temporal and the parietal is where the Wernicke's area is. Wernicke's area helps us perceive our understanding of written and spoken language. This is where grammar is formed. Up here towards the frontal lobe, about in this area, is going to be the Broca's area. Subtle differences in each human as to where these are. If we do brain surgery, we do want to map the Broca's area as well as the Wernicke's area to determine where they are, because damage to the Wernicke's area would impact your ability to create sentences, and Broca's area on the motor area of the frontal lobe would have an impact on our ability to speak, to actually get the words out. Another way that we can view the brain is to view the brain in a longitudinal section, so a sagittal section that's going to divide the brain into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. So we're going to start with the anatomical model that is colored, and we're going to talk about some of the anatomical pieces that are in here. Now you can see elements of the frontal lobe. You can see that that precentral gyrus folds into the longitudinal fissure, as well as the postcentral gyrus folds into longitudinal fissure. And remember, the blue represents the parietal lobe. And then we get back here to the occipital lobe, with this area here being the area of primary vision. So all of those action potentials from the retina are destined for this area of the occipital lobe, and then associated in this region here. The brain also has a fifth inner lobe that is the insula. It's a very small region inside the tucked in the folds of the temporal lobe as well. We can also see the corpus callosum. Genu region is towards the anterior or rostral end, and the splenium region is towards the caudal or posterior end. This right here is showing us the septum pellucidum, which is a division between the two lateral ventricles. Ideally, we might name them ventricle 1 and 2, but because they are symmetrical, we call them collectively the lateral ventricles, or ventricles 1 and 2, but we don't specifically label each one. The septum pellucidum divides those two ventricles, and then there's a little hole, a foramina, that allows fluid from the lateral ventricles to drain into the third ventricle. And so we're looking at the third ventricle space here. The third ventricle is built laterally by the thalamus, so the yo-yo thalamus, which we're going to look at in a little bit later. You'll see that structure outside of the brain here. This blue here is the choroid plexus, which is a combination of capillaries and ependymal cells that form a blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. From the third ventricle, fluid's going to drain through the aqueduct, also known as the aqueduct of Sylvius, into this fourth ventricle, which forms this little peaked diamond-shaped area. From there, fluid will drain out a medial aperture into the space here. Some may continue down the central canal of the spinal cord, and there's also lateral ventricles, one that would be projecting towards you and one that would be projecting away. That's not obvious in this model. Other structures of note. So this is the lateral wall of the thalamus. The third ventricle sits in this area. Just below it is the hypothalamus. So the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, the big yo-yo. We'll see that again later. The hypothalamus here, and then off of the hypothalamus would project the pituitary gland, which often is not reflected in these models. There's also an epithalamus that's right back here. It's the pineal gland or pineal gland that is going to be secreting melatonin and is involved in some of your sleep-wake cycles as well as reproductive cycles. As we continue down the back, I'd like to draw your attention to the midbrain area, which is characterized by a mammillary body on the inferior aspect and a superior and inferior colliculi at the superior side of the midbrain. The aqueduct is going to travel through the midbrain. This region here will have the fibers that are transferring signals to upper regions of the brain. And these superior and inferior colliculi, because there are 4 of them, they are known collectively as the corpora quadrigemina. And this forms a roof over the aqueduct, referred to as the tectum. As we move down, you'll notice here E is the pons, and then lower is the medulla oblongata. We should also talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum has white matter that branches that makes the arbor vitae, and the leaf-like folds on the surface are known as folia. Now in the Amazon model, the cerebellum is not quite anatomically correct. We need branching of white matter to form the arbor vitae, and the folds being the folia. Okay, so let's look at other anatomy. So here's our frontal lobe. Oh, my probe got stuck to the magnet. As we move up, we're going to find the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex is also known as the precentral gyrus, and then the postcentral gyrus, or primary sensory cortex. So this is the differentiation between frontal lobes and parietal lobes. That information, that gyrus, that fold, goes all the way to the interior of the brain. Then we get into the parietal lobe, and back here is the occipital lobe. We are again looking at the corpus callosum, which is connecting the two hemispheres of the brain and can be viewed superficially by peering through the longitudinal sulcus or the longitudinal fissure, and we are getting communication between two hemispheres through the corpus callosum. This region is known as the splenium. This region is known as the genu. Again, we have the septum pellucidum that is dividing and keeping both lateral ventricles separate and independent. They drain through the foramina, which is not apparent on this model, into this region, which is the third ventricle. Again, there's the choroid plexus that is a combination of ependymal cells and capillaries forming a blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. The third ventricle is made up, has lateral walls, which are the hypothalamus, and the region down here is known as the hypothalamus. There is not a particularly fabulous example of a pineal gland on this model. The other thing you'll note as we start to look at the midbrain area is that this model doesn't have a very large superior and inferior colliculi to make up the corpora quadrigemina of the tectum, which is the roof above the aqueduct that you can see here, sometimes used or described as the aqueduct of Sylvius, which was an eponym. Mammillary body would be on this side. Then we have the pons region. The pons region will have some of the pedicles as well as the midbrain that are going to anchor the cerebellum as well as the cerebrum to the brain stem. As we move from midbrain to pons, we get down to the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata, as it crosses through the foramen magnum, becomes the spinal cord. There is a canal known as the central canal that will run down the spinal cord center. Okay, so now we want to look at the brainstem again, and one of the things I like about this particular model is that it's held together by magnets, and so we can break off the cerebrum, the occipital lobe, and take the cerebellum off, and we are left with this. This is both the brainstem as well as the diencephalon. So if you may remember, looking at it in cross-section, the third ventricle sits in this region. Just on either side is the thalamus, and then down low is the hypothalamus. Pineal gland isn't strongly noted here. From the third ventricle, you can see this duct. It's known as the aqueduct, or the aqueduct of Sylvius, and this would lead to a ventricle that is the fourth ventricle. And I'm going to point out the fourth ventricle here. So the fourth ventricle is made up, so here's the aqueduct, and here's the fourth ventricle. It makes almost like a little diamond shape right here between the cerebellum and the pons. So there's the fourth ventricle. And from here, we would have a medial aperture that would dump fluid into the space around the cerebellum. There are also lateral apertures, one that would be dumping cerebral spinal fluid towards you, and the other one away. Okay, so as we look at this, we also will note the midbrain area. Right here is the little bump that makes up the mammillary body. And on the back side, so the very surface here towards the superior aspect of the brain, you have your superior colliculi and your inferior colliculi. These are two bumps that make up the corpora quadrigemina, and it makes sort of a roof over the aqueduct here, and so we sometimes refer to this as the tectum, or the roof over the aqueduct. Your pons is in this region here, and then again your medulla oblongata or medulla oblongata. The other thing that's kind of interesting to note about this structure, I'm going to put the other half of it on. We're going to connect them. So here I'm looking from the inferior aspect. So there's that artery again. My mammillary bodies would be in here. Here's the optic nerve and the optic chiasm. And what you're looking at is that yo-yo structure, the diencephalon made of the thalamus and then the hypothalamus. So if I rotate this over so that you're looking from the top, so a superior view down onto the anatomy, we should be able to see the two halves of the thalamus. Coming off the side in a kind of pointed nature are the lateral ventricles. So they would be sitting here and here, running through the cerebrum. Here's a bit of that choroid plexus because those two lateral ventricles are going to fill the third ventricle. This is going to be creating cerebral spinal fluid for the third ventricle, and that's going to come in through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. And then from the third ventricle through, what we can no longer see is the aqueduct. But what we can see, sort of pinched between my fingers, are four bulges, the corpora quadrigemina, and the superior ones are those at the top, and the inferior ones are those at the bottom. And these are going to relay visual reflexes and auditory reflexes as well. And then you'll move down through the pons area and the medulla oblongata. This area of the brain is also connected to other regions of the brain by peduncles. And so that is the term used for these tracts of information that connect the brainstem to the cerebellum. That's a portion of the cerebellum in cross-section. Okay, so the last thing we need to consider is the brain from an inferior aspect. We're going to start with the colored model and then move over to the Amazon model. So if we look at the brain with the colored model, tract of neurons that are carrying signals through the cribriform plate that came in through the olfactory hairs that extend through the cribriform plate. And this is our first cranial nerve. The next cranial nerve here, labeled number 2, is the optic nerve. You have one on each side, both the patient's left and the patient's right. This is the left side of the brain. This is the right side of the brain because we're looking at the inferior aspect. And right here is the optic chiasm. And the optic chiasm is where some of the visual pathways cross. Additionally, down below, we have cranial nerve number 3, so it sits right here and here, comes off of the midbrain area, and this is the oculomotor nerve. The midbrain area here not only has the oculomotor nerve extending off of its surface, but you will also note two round areas here. These two round areas are known as the mammary bodies. They were named perhaps for an obvious reason. The midbrain extends down to the pons, which is this bulge here. I would like to draw your attention to cranial nerve number 5 over here, which is the trigeminal nerve. This is a very large nerve that extends laterally off of the pons, symmetrical on each side. And then we get back into the medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain. Mammillary bodies extend off the inferior aspect, and we would also have the stalk that would lead to the pituitary gland. Right here is the optic chiasm, optic nerves, and olfactory bulbs. Now, if we look at the Amazon model, you're going to find the lack of color. One of the things the Amazon model has that I kind of like, and that we'll study at a later time period, is this structure here, which is the basilar artery. These are vertebral arteries that come into it, and they become part of the vascularization of the brain. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to rotate this to the side so that we can kind of see some of the deeper structures of the brain. So again, right up here is the olfactory bulb. This is the very first cranial nerve. And you'll notice here and here are the optic nerves at the optic chiasm. The mammary bodies that sit right here, are not as apparent on this model. But this is part of the midbrain area. This then forms the pons, and here is the medulla oblongata.